Welcome back, bosses. It's truly a pleasure to have on Jim Rogers to the show to me today. The adventure capitalist, the investment biker. Jim, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here. I even wore a clean shirt just for you.
Hey, so did I. It's a special occasion, right?
Yep.
Your book, The Adventure Capitalist, has been a huge inspiration to me, both on many different levels. So I think that this book really can be an inspiration to a lot of people, especially people getting started out, just to realize how interesting and fun investing can be, especially when you par it with overseas pursuits and adventure as you did. But Jim, maybe you could start by just telling us about the two Guinness World Records that you have, and if they still stand up.
Well, I actually was in the Guinness Book of Records 3 times, Sam. It doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't pay the rent, but my mother did like it a great deal. I know the first one, the record has been broken since. Most records get broken. I think, and I don't know, the second and third, when I went around the world on a motorcycle, I don't think anybody has topped that yet. And I went around the world in a car, and I don't think anybody's topped that. But Sam, it really doesn't matter. I did it for the adventure and for the thrill. I didn't do it for the Guinness Book of Records.
And were you traveling much before you took those 2 trips? Had you been overseas much at all?
Well, no. When I was a student, I didn't have any money. I did hitchhike around Europe in my second university. So I did some of that. And then I very much wanted adventure. One reason I retired early was so I could have adventure. And I did do some motorcycling, went across China, went through Central Europe, etc. But most of that stuff was pretty difficult during the days of Red China and the Soviet Union. I did some, but finally I did the Big Daddy, and I went around the world on a motorcycle. I got permission from Soviet Union. I got permission from China, and off I went.
And did having any type of a status as an American investor and some of the things you had done up to that point help you kind of get that permission, or did you just do it the old-fashioned traditional way of cutting the red tape?
A Wall Street investor showing up in Red China, that was not quite their idea of who should be in China. And likewise, the Soviet Union, for the first few years, they ignored me. And then finally, I remember I went there, the guy wrote me and said, yeah, sure, you can do that. I didn't believe it because I've been trying for so long. I went to see him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. What's wrong with you? Of course you can do this. I should have known that there was an indication the Soviet Union was changing rapidly.
Yeah.
But it took a long time. And I don't know if it was just because I was a Wall Street investor that they ignored me. I think it's just that I was an American and a foreigner, and nobody had ever asked them before. Nobody ever asked me to asked them to drive across the Soviet Union. I remember the guy saying to me, said, okay, we're going to let you do it, but why would you want to do it? Are you crazy?
Oh my gosh.
And I remember the Chinese. The first Chinese word I learned was mayo, which basically means no, we don't have it. You cannot get it. Don't worry. I would say things like, well, are there roads? Mayo. Are there hotels? Mayo. Are there restaurants? Mayo. Everything was, are you crazy? What's wrong with you? But in the end, I did it and went around the world a couple of times.
Oh my gosh. This was going to be my next question was you've gone across China multiple times. I think going back to the 80s was the first trip, but based on what you just said, I'm guessing you didn't speak much of any Mandarin at that point.
Oh, no, I spoke no Mandarin. No, I spoke, I'm hopeless I have 2 children who are native speakers of Mandarin. They shocked the Chinese TV people, but I do a lot of sign language, pointing at things. You go to a restaurant, you point to the neighbors what they're eating, or you go in the kitchen and point to the food. No, I don't speak any Mandarin.
Yeah, as well, it's taking a train across the Soviet Union or Siberia is intimidating to a large degree to many people, but you drove across it without speaking Russian. and driving a motorcycle across China would be intimidating enough for even local Mandarin speakers, but you did it without speaking any Mandarin. It's quite the
adventure. Across the Soviet Union twice, once in a motorcycle, once in a car. I'm really surprised to be alive. I shouldn't be alive. I'm glad I'm alive. Very glad I'm alive. But no, looking back on both of my trips, I really shouldn't be alive.
Amazing stories. Going back to those trips, in the day-to-day, the planning, did you generally have just an outline for where you needed to be at certain times? But I guess more my interest is like in the day-to-day, did you know exactly what you were going to do the next day and where you needed to be? Or was it kind of like wake up and figure it out?
Well, you had to wake up and figure it out because, well, first of all, there were a few basics. I didn't want to be in Siberia in the winter. I knew that would not be a good thing to do. I basically knew the weather calendar, but most of this you cannot plan. You don't know where the wars will be. You don't know where the epidemics will be. You don't know where roads will be closed. No, you pretty much have to do it as you go along, including visas. Visas are only good for a certain time period. So many of the visas you have to get on the road. And even that sometimes is complicated. Everything's complicated. Yeah. This is not driving to Washington for the weekend or something. Yeah. This were complicated things.
I love some of the tips and tricks that you had in the book. And one of them that so much of it is difficult to relate to because we have smartphones, internet, and GPS. And so one of the tricks that you'd done, or it seemed to do, is whenever you got into a big city, you would hire a taxi driver. You pay the taxi driver to follow them to your hotel, so you didn't have to figure out all the city roads. Which now, of course, I don't know if it would be as useful, but I'm sure still in some places where it might be hard to get internet, it would be a good trick. But now we're so used to just navigating by phone, but we forget how much of a real adventure it would have been without GPS and just looking at old road maps.
Well, there was no GPS, at least on my motorcycle trip. But as far as, I got lost in enough cities. I knew where I was supposed to go, but even if I followed maps or something, I learned quickly enough that it took a long time to get from the outskirts of the city to the hotel that I was looking for. And I realized very quickly, well, the taxi drivers know. So it's a lot cheaper for me to pay the guy and I'll follow him than to wander around all day or all night trying to find where I'm going.
I want to talk a little bit about the investment side of this, particularly interested in the Eastern adventure and the Eastern investing that you're looking at. And one of the mentions in Adventure Capitalists was that during the I don't know if it was called the Great, but the Asian economic crisis going back a couple of decades ago, that the countries were committing this kind of fatal financial error in which they were borrowing short and committing long. And that kind of led it into the Asian crisis. Can you explain kind of what that dynamic is?
Well, Sam, unfortunately, people have been doing that throughout history. Everybody gets carried away with themselves. They think they find great opportunities, and often they do. And there are people who've made fortunes doing that. But there are many more people in history who borrowed short and lent long, and they get squeezed and they go bankrupt. And that's certainly what happened in the Asia crisis. In Thailand, Malaysia, many places, they would borrow a lot of money. It was very easy to borrow money there for a while. They'd borrow the money and they'd put it to work at high rates. But then when the crunch came, that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
One of the basic rules of money and life is do not borrow short and lend long. If you lend long, be sure you can get out.
Do you see
when
that
you
happening?
Cannot get out, that's called bankruptcy.
Do you see that happening right now? Any like at a governmental level or any place regionally around the U.S.? I'm sorry, around the world.
Around the U.S., of course, everybody, many people. Money is free right now. Money is free just about everywhere in the world, but certainly in the U.S. And there are states and cities that are going to wind up in serious trouble. Some states which may have problems. Connecticut, Illinois, there are lots of places borrowing lots of money. And at the moment, they think it's okay because they can borrow very cheaply. But as I say, history is pretty clear. This is a dangerous tactic unless you really know what you're doing.
Jim, when you were running around the world in your different trips and you were looking at making investments, what were you typically looking at? Did you have kind of a default investment, like you would go in and buy publicly traded equities, or were you looking at more real estate or alternative investments, or was it just different depending on where you're at?
The main thing in most countries, now called emerging market countries, if they had a stock market, that was pretty much it, but often there was no real bond market. You could buy currency on the black market, but you can't really do that very efficiently to be a big investor to invest a lot of money. If I could find a stock market, that's where I started.
Okay. And I think you looked at doing land in a couple of different places, including Ireland. Did you ever end up investing in land on your trip?
I did not, because I have learned over my life that I prefer to be liquid, or think I'm liquid anyway. And land is not something that is. A lot of people make fortunes investing in land and property, but I always like to think I'm liquid.
Got it. Jim, who's the best investor or the smartest investor that you've ever worked with?
I haven't worked with many people. I'm pretty much a loner. I don't have an answer to that question because I've never really, I once, when I was young, I worked for a guy named Roy Neuberger, who started a firm called Neuberger Berman, but he was an astonishing short-term trader. I'm hopeless at it. I'm totally hopeless. If he owned a stock for a day, it was long-term. He didn't know much about what some companies did, but he had a list of 50 or 100 companies, IBM, 3M, GE, names like that. He knew almost every tick in those stocks, and he could trade them brilliantly. If you ask him what General Electric did, he probably didn't know. He didn't care because he was so good at short-term trading.
Yeah. It's an incredible skill set. Certainly nothing that I can do myself effectively either. Before your trips, didn't you have a fund with George Soros? And I'd read in that during the 70s or the mid to late 70s, that fund was up like some insane amount, like 4,000%, at which time like the S&P 500 was up 40% over the same 7 or 8 years.
Well, yeah, we did have a hedge fund in the 70s, which are not a good investment time for most markets. We did go up 4,300% in 10 years, while the market was up 47%. But that was a long time ago, Sam. You might as well ask me about my first wife or where I went to college or something. It's not very relevant anymore.
Yeah. Well, what were you investing in that you could have got 4,000% gains when the S&P was up 40%?
Well, everything: stocks, bonds, currencies all over the world, commodities, long, short. We sold short a lot, and we used enormous leverage. Looking back on it, that was certainly part. We were right a lot of times, obviously, but we also used a lot of leverage as well. The real thing, Sam, was we got it right a lot. We both loved what we were doing, and we're having a lot of fun.
Sounds great. Amazing. We have a group of listeners we call our Patreons, and one of them has a question. If you don't mind, we'll ask it. It's from Jeff Holmes, and he says, I quote, "I read a number of things that Mr. Rogers have written. Another respected investment guru, Jeremy Grantham, is predicting that the U.S. stock market is in an overpriced super bubble, and that an investor might consider investing in emerging markets because emerging markets are not as overpriced. I wonder what Mr. Rogers' thoughts are about this prediction that the U.S. stock market is in a super bubble that is about to pop. And is there any recommendations into moving into investments in emerging markets?"
Well, Sam or Jeffrey, U.S. market's been going up since 2009. It's the longest period in American history where we've had a long, ongoing bull market. That doesn't mean it cannot go on another 13 years, but it never has. So we're certainly not in the beginning of a bull market, that's for sure, not in the U.S. And these things have always come to an end eventually. I am not shorting this market yet, but I certainly expect when we have a bear market again, it'll be the worst in my lifetime. And the reason for that is, in 2008-9, we had a big problem because of too much debt. Sam, look out the window. The debt since 2009 has skyrocketed everywhere in the world. There's never been a period in world history when there was so much debt and so much money printing. So I'm not trying to scare people. I'm just telling factually, we've never had so much debt. We're going to have more bear markets. And the next one has to be the worst in my lifetime. Now, in Washington, they say, no, they're not going to be any more bear markets. We've solved the problem. We know what we're doing. Well, if you believe them, fine. But I've read enough history to know that there've always been bear markets and there always will be. Now, some of the people in Washington don't know history, or if they do, they think they're smarter than history. But Sam, one of the major lessons of history, if not the major lesson of history, is most people do not learn the lessons of history. They think even if they hear the lessons of history, they think it doesn't count or they're smarter than it. We had a president recently who thought he was smarter than history, even if he knew history. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. Many people don't learn the lessons of history.
And how about
I want to tell you, Sam, I know I'm not smarter than history.
And how about any recommendations moving into emerging markets? No, you're living in Singapore right now, I believe. I know that's not emerging, but you have a view into a lot of regional developing markets.
Well, a problem these days is nearly everything has gone up a lot in this long bull market. Yes, maybe some emerge. Russia right now is pretty cheap for many. In fact, they've closed it down. You can't even invest there right now. Wow. But most emerging markets participated as well. If you can find one, well, I did invest in Uzbekistan a month or so ago. So there are some. Cambodia, I've opened an account. I may invest there. These are markets that are not on anybody's investment screen yet. So if you can find places like that, sure. But most, India, all-time highs was recently, went through the roof. Most markets went through the roof.
I love this quote that I'm not sure if it came out of your book or I read it somewhere that was attributed to you. It says, if you were smart in 1807, you moved to London. If you were smart in 1907, you moved to New York. And if you're smart in 2007, you moved to Asia. I love this. And do you think that still rings true today?
Well, I stated that in 2007 when I was moving to Asia, and I told a reporter that, and he wrote it down, and it's still floating around out there. I did say it, and it was accurate. At least in my view, it was accurate. It still is accurate. If you look at Europe or many places, the debts are staggering. The UK is essentially bankrupt. The US is essentially bankrupt. Mm-hmm. This is in 1907, the US was not bankrupt. It was on the verge of becoming the most successful country in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. We're not on the verge of becoming the most successful country in the 21st century.
So Jim, it's been about 20 years, I think, since you took the trip in the car, correct?
Yes.
Around the year 2000. So if you were to go and do that trip again now, 22 years later, and you kind of went to the same countries, what would be some of the biggest changes you'd expect to see, maybe outside of the current situation in Russia, Ukraine, which is somewhat of an obvious?
Well, one of the biggest changes is capitalism. There are markets in many countries now, or many countries that did not have markets, stock markets or investment markets, or if they did, they were fledgling. Credit cards, there are now credit cards nearly everywhere in the world. Internet. On my first trip around the world, there was no way to let anybody know I was alive. I would send postcards from many countries, hoping my parents would know I was still alive. Now I could just go on the internet. The internet is everywhere now. I was constantly worried about getting money across borders or getting money, but now there are credit cards everywhere. So there are things that have changed. Whether it's the modern world or just as prosperity has occurred occurred. There were lots of communists and socialists on my first trip, even my second trip. Nobody wants to be a communist anymore, Sam. And if they do, they want to be a rich communist. Capitalism won that battle. Even the people who claim they're communists, claim that they're special communists or special socialists.
Any other big trips you have planned coming up, or any other books that you're planning on putting together?
Well, I don't have any. I hope that someday soon, my daughters who speak native Mandarin, as I said before, I hope to drive around China just so I can show them China, and also so they can learn about travel and independence, et cetera. I don't have anything planned at the moment, but that would probably be first on my list. I've only traveled a bit in Iran, and it's very, very difficult for Americans now to travel in Iran. I've been to North Korea twice, but now it's illegal for Americans to go to North Korea. There are still places on my list, but no gigantic trips like in the past, unless I do drive around China with my children.
Yeah. Speaking of your children, Jim, what type of investing advice do you give them, or will you give or lay out for them in the future?
Well, when they were babies, I got them piggy banks. And whenever there was money, we went and put it in the piggy bank. I wanted them, many people, when they get money, as children especially, they go and spend it on a doll or an ice cream or something. I wanted them to have the mindset that when you get money, it's to be put in the bank, it's to be saved. I wanted them to have that mindset about money. And when the piggy bank gets full, we go to the big bank and put it in the big bank and earn interest. That was and it seems to have been fairly successful. You can ask me in 20 years if it was successful or not. That was and if and when they ask me about investing, I will tell them what I know. I don't want to try to force that on them. I have learned that if you force people to learn something, they usually don't learn it very well, if they learn it at all. But when people are eager, enthusiastic about learning something, it's more likely to work.
How do you like Singapore? I believe that's where you live, in terms of its market economy and potential future.
Well, Singapore has certainly been the most successful country in the world over the past 50 years, I would say. We will see in the next 50 years. I can give you a scenario that it will continue to be thriving and growing. Or I can also give you a scenario that in 50 years it won't be a Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew, who was the guy who really made Singapore, has said before he died, if you make mistakes, guys, you're not going to survive. He did also said he would come back from the grave if they started making mistakes. He hasn't showed up yet, so I guess he thinks everything is still okay. No, I'm very happy in Singapore. Everything works in Singapore. Yeah. Nothing like New York, where nothing works. On the other hand, it's not as exciting as New York. Very few cities in the world are. No, we're very happy in Singapore. We moved here so my children would know Asia and would speak Mandarin. And in their lifetime, both of those are going to be extremely important.
Excellent. And you're planning on staying there for the foreseeable future?
Well, who knows? Yeah, but if you asked me 30 years ago, I would have said, what are you talking about? I'm not going to live in Singapore. Well, here I am. Yeah. But who knows where I'm going to go next? But at the moment, we're all very happy here, and we're here. My older daughter is now a freshman at university, and she says that we robbed her of her American youth. So she insisted on going to a university in the U.S., but we're all here.
Jim, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. You've been a great inspiration to myself, and I know a lot of others with your books and your adventures, and also your investing. If others want to find out more about your books, do you recommend they just go to your website, jimrogers.com, or do you have any other place that people should look you up?
Well, you can go to Amazon. It's easy to buy books these days. Bookstores, if they don't have them, they can order them. Amazon will certainly sell you just about anything. My books are still in print. I have published some books in Japanese and Korean, even Mandarin in recent year or two, which are not in English, but I don't read Japanese, so I don't know what I said. I hope that they were translated properly.
Yeah. Capture the
I've had some
personality.
fantastic bestsellers, and I've had, I think, 2 or 3 #1 bestsellers in Japan. I don't know what they say. I know what I said. I will tell you, if you want to have a bestseller in Japan, what I wrote was that, well, Japan is peaking and is in decline now, and I explained all the reasons why. And so, since I'm a foreigner, many people wanted to read that to see what this foreigner says. And they got popular, and more than one publisher published my thoughts. But if you really want to be, and I also said Korea is on the rise. Well, the Japanese hate the Koreans, and the Koreans hate the Japanese. So if you say, well, Japan is in decline and Korea is on the rise, everybody in both countries wants to read the book to see what this crazy foreigner says.
I love it.
I love Korea and I love Japan.
Yeah.
I didn't realize. But if you want to have a bestseller, Sam, that's all you got to do. I've written the same book 3 times, published the same book 2 or 3 times.
I love it. Jim, thanks so much for coming on the show and spending time and a bit of your experience and history with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Let's do it again sometime. Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.